Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in to the 17th Take, a project brought to you by the Community College of Philadelphia's Communication and Media Studies program and CCPTV Studio. As college students, we're coming together to dig into the stories, experiences, and issues at the heart of Philly's people, neighborhoods, and communities, coming to you from 17th Street and Spring Garden. In today's episode, we will explore the impact of gun violence on Philly's youth, how it affects children and families, the challenges facing the neighborhoods they are a part of, and the ways communities are stepping up to support, protect, and help them heal. We'll hear from those on the front lines, highlight stories, and look at the efforts helping shape a safer future for Philly's next generation. Gun violence in Philadelphia isn't just a headline, it's something that rewrites people's lives in an instant. And while the city last year saw the largest single drop in homicides in recorded history, those numbers don't tell the whole story. Because behind every statistic is a person, a family, a block, a school community. And especially for city's young people, many of whom are exposed to gun violence at an alarming rate, the impact is not abstract, it's lived, it's felt, and it lingers. According to CDC data analyzed by Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, firearms are the leading cause of death for children and teens aged 1 through 19 across the United States. In Pennsylvania, the city of Philadelphia accounts for over half of the state's youth homicides by firearms. So many of Philly youth have been killed, injured, involved in, or witnessed a shooting, or even lost someone close to them. And yet, their voices are often missing when decisions are being made about policies, prevention, and healing. So today, we want to slow down and talk about what's really happening. Not just in the data, but in the lives of Philadelphians. Because gun violence might be a label the city gets stuck with, but this city is not a label. It's a city of heartfelt people, vibrant culture, of neighborhoods full of history, resistance, and love. And those impacted by violence deserve to be understood, supported, and heard. We won't let tragedy be the final word. So I'd like to welcome my co-host, Karen, who will join me in discussing the human cost of Philly's gun violence crisis and the solutions that researchers, youth, and community organizations are building to confront it.
Thank you so much, Siani, and thank you everyone for tuning in. Before we jump in, we want to acknowledge something really important. This is obviously a very heavy topic, so if anyone needs to take a break, take a breath, or just come back to the episode later, that's completely okay. At the end of this, we'll share resources for anyone who needs support. Today we'll be sharing our own experiences, looking closely at the patterns and root causes of the gun violence crisis in Philly, and speaking with experts from the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia's Center for Violence Prevention, where they spend every day studying what actually works in order to prevent harm like this.
When I think about gun violence in Philly, I don't think first about the news or statistic. I think back to one of the most traumatic and difficult experiences of my life. When I was still in high school, my family and I lived in West Philly. One day, we left to go eat at a restaurant. It was just a normal moment, something we had done countless times before. But when we returned home, everything felt like it had changed. The bullet holes went straight through our front door. Some of the bullets had even ricocheted into our living room. The same space where we would relax, chill, and it felt safe. I remember standing there, trying to process how violence had entered our home without us even being present. A few moments later, police arrived, and they began questioning us. They explained that a man had been running from porch to porch, trying to escape his attacker, who was chasing him down the block. A conflict gone wrong, they said. And while no one had died, what stayed with me was not just the damage, but the lingering thought of what could have happened if we had been home that day. The what if never really leaves you. It changes how you move through your neighborhood, how safe you feel in your own space, and your relationship to the community that you're a part of. That day didn't just change how I saw my home. It changed how I saw the world. And unfortunately, stories like mine are not rare in this city. They're becoming a shared experience for too many people, especially in neighborhoods that have already faced long histories of disinvestment and neglect.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing your story, Siani. I mean, just like you said, this unfortunately is not uncommon anymore. So many people, especially here in Philly, can relate to some degree to your story. And acts of violence like that, like you said, they just never really leave you, not completely.
Mm. Exactly. And as I spent more time reflecting on that experience, I've realized that it is so important to talk about this issue, not only as a tragedy, but as something that demands understanding, accountability, and real solutions.
Yeah, and your story proves that gun violence has a far-reaching impact, even if you're not directly injured or harmed. And researchers have actually developed a term for it. It's called vicarious trauma. So the National Child Traumatic Stress Network defines it as the emotional residue that's left behind when you're indirectly exposed to instances of violence. So that can be either through media or stories or even just the experiences of the people around you. And in cities like Philadelphia, where violence is concentrated, those exposures to traumatic events can become constant.
Wow. And that exposure has long term effects, too. The gun violence epidemic in this country and its effects in Philly is a public health crisis for children and communities that ripples through generations. When we talk about effects, we're looking at far more than just immediate injuries. For children, the trauma of witnessing or surviving gun violence creates lasting scars. According to Johns Hopkins researchers, long term effects can include PTSD, anxiety, and depression. This pervasive stress can affect brain development and lead to lifelong challenges with learning, concentration, and academic success.
Wow.
And when you widen the lens beyond individual children, you start to see how those effects can reach across the entire neighborhood. Because when many children are carrying trauma at the same time, it shapes the emotional climate of a community, how people relate to one another, how safe they feel stepping outside, and even how willing they are to invest in or stay rooted in that same neighborhood.
Yeah, and that brings me back to the point that you made earlier about disinvestment and unequal opportunity for communities, often those that are already struggling with systemic disadvantages. The effects are equally devastating. Fear tends to destroy community trust. It drives down property costs and correlates directly, according to the Philadelphia Department of Health, with the unemployment rate in the city.
Right. And when we talk about gun violence in Philly, the conversation too often gets oversimplified. People make assumptions about who is violent, where violence happens, and why. But the data tells a more complicated story. A 2021 report by the city notes that neighborhoods with the highest rate of shootings are also the neighborhoods with the highest poverty rates and least resources, like stable housing, jobs, and educational opportunities. Violence is not just random, it follows a pattern, patterns shaped by policy decisions.
Absolutely. And as people talk about gun violence in the city, I think that aspect really needs to come into focus more. Neighborhoods that face longstanding disinvestment are hurt the most, and this trend is affecting the youth too. So while shooting numbers, for example, are actually going down, the teens are making up a larger share of victims, according to a report by NBC 10. And according to UPenn's Leonard Davis Institute, most of the child gun injuries and deaths within Philly occur in the same neighborhoods. They're often low income, predominantly Black and Hispanic, and in what are referred to as low opportunity neighborhoods, which is a metric gauged by the Child Opportunity Index. And according to that data, low opportunity neighborhoods often lack quality schools, safe housing, clean air, parks, access to healthy foods, and economic opportunities. The Institute reports that youth in these low opportunity neighborhoods in the city are actually 2.5 times more likely to sustain gun injuries than the youth in other areas.
It's heartbreaking how systematic disinvestment can impact the ability of neighborhoods, communities, of families, and youth to even feel safe.
Yeah, and it's also important to recognize something that gets overlooked a lot of times, which is this pattern of disinvestment, which heightens children's vulnerability to violence. It also shapes the conditions under which some young people become involved in carrying or using firearms themselves. So research from the National Institute of Health, the NIH, has found that youth who perpetuate gun violence often share the exact same risk factors as youth who later become victims. So that includes chronic exposure to violence, unaddressed traumas, housing instability, limited access to after-school opportunities, and a lack of trusted adults. NIH also notes that youth who carry weapons, which is often for their own perceived protection after they've witnessed or been victims to violence so many times, have an increased likelihood of facing violent situations. So, in other words, children are cycling through the same harmful conditions, not because they're inherently dangerous, but because the environment around them has failed to protect them and to provide them with resources.
And yet, when you listen to public narratives, people often jump straight to blame. It's the pop culture, or it's the parents, or even it's just the kids today. Misunderstandings like these affect how we talk about solutions. They reduce a complex challenge of social inequality into individual fault. And that makes it harder for communities to advocate for what they actually need.
Yeah, and that's why it's so important to humanize the people and the communities that are impacted by this gun violence.
Karen, I know this semester that you were an intern for the Philadelphia Center for Gun Violence Reporting. Can you talk more about their organization and what they do, as well as how it's impacted your view of reporting on gun violence in the city?
Absolutely, yeah. I learned so much working with Philly Center for Gun Violence Reporting. It's also known as PCGVR. That organization actually focuses on how journalists can report on gun violence in the city more ethically and with more care. It's really important that we don't perpetuate more violence in the way that we write about it, and also that we protect the victims and the co-victims of gun violence. And that goes back to what we were talking about earlier, the vicarious trauma. Those are the co-victims of gun violence. So that issue can be exacerbated by inaccurate or insensitive reporting. For example, something that I hadn't thought about until I was in this internship was people using the photos and the name of the people perpetuating this gun violence in their reporting. It can actually give those people the exact attention that they were seeking when they went and caused this kind of harm to the communities. And unfortunately, they've seen that this causes a domino effect, and it can actually create it can cause a domino effect where other people who are seeking the same kind of attention may also try to perpetuate the same kind of harms in their communities.
Wow. Yeah, it is so important to humanize their stories. And we want to pause here to highlight those people because honoring their lives mattered. So we wanted to make some space for them. Ethan Parker was a joyful 12-year-old whose voice lit up his home and block in North Philly, a natural performer and loving brother. He was always singing. His family says his melody is still with them. Angelique Holloman was a bright, funny, and generous 15-year-old who made everyone around her feel at home. She loved basketball, making TikToks, and looking out for people she cared about. The warmth and joy she shared continues to shine through everyone who loved her. Azir Gonzalez was a bright and kind 14-year-old boy whose heart and energy touched everyone around him. He was a top athlete, winning awards in basketball, football, and more, loved by his family, classmates, and neighbors. And lastly, I want to take a moment to honor the life of someone whose death hit close to home for all of us, Kada Scott. Kada was a student, a friend, a daughter, and a light to the people around her. And like countless other young people in the city, she deserved a future she never got the chance to grow into. There are so many names, so many stories that we can't fit into a single episode. But we want people to know that their lives mattered. We refuse to let them be remembered only through statistics or safety alerts. Because when we lose someone to gun violence, we're losing talent, joy, potential. This is someone's entire future. And we can't let their stories end there.
Exactly. We can't let them just become another number that we scroll past or a news story headline that disappears after a day. This is exactly why projects like the Philadelphia Obituary Project exist. They write humanizing obituaries for victims of gun violence so that they aren't reduced to just a moment of tragedy. Their work reminds us that a person and their life cannot be summarized in just one paragraph. These are people with histories, families, hopes, ambitions, and their stories deserve to be honored in depth and with dignity.
And honoring their stories also means asking a hard but necessary question. Where do we go from here? Because even with the grief, even with the trauma, there's also hope and real measurable progress happening right now in Philadelphia. Over the past few years, the city has taken steps that show what's possible when communities, researchers, and policymakers work together. For example, the city has expanded community-based violence intervention programs, strengthened mentorship and trauma counseling for youth, and invested in environmental improvements like greening vacant lots. All strategies linked to meaningful reductions in shootings. Grassroots organizations and advocates are working to provide support within neighborhoods and communities. Hospitals are also playing a growing role through violence intervention programs that support survivors to navigate systems and promote healing. These aren't abstract ideas. Their efforts already underway, led by people and organizations who believe a safer Philadelphia is possible. And one of the groups at the forefront of that work is CHOP's Center for Violence Prevention.
Olivia Best, a violence prevention supervisor, and Camilla Jones, a violence prevention specialist, both at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia's Center for Violence Prevention, or CVP, are here to discuss the center's work and what a safer city for our youth can look like. CHOP CVP is committed to reducing exposure to and the impact of violence among children and families. A key part of their mission is to prevent firearm violence. CVP approaches this issue through the lens of public health promotion and injury prevention. CVP is dedicated to ensuring that youth feel safe, strong, and supported in their neighborhoods and communities. Welcome, Olivia and Camilla. Thank you so much for joining us. Can you both please introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about CVP and what you guys do?
Sure. So my name is Olivia Best. I'm the supervisor for our violence intervention program. So I'm supporting Camilla and 3 coworkers who are doing the violence prevention work outside in the field. So our work at CVP is supporting youth and families after a violent injury to really support them in their communities to heal, connecting to resources, supporting with advocacy where that's needed, and helping them rebuild the capacity to re-enter their communities and heal from their trauma.
Right.
I'm Camilla Jones, a violence intervention specialist, and like Olivia said, we help youth and their family after a violent incident kind of get implemented back into the community and support them with their needs.
Yeah. Wow. Obviously very important work that you both do for the community. So I just want to say thank you for that. And yeah, let's get into this, I guess. So from your perspective, what misconceptions do people most often have about gun violence and trauma among Philadelphia youth, and what's important for people to understand?
Yeah, so I think a common misconception is that youth involved in gun-related violence are quote unquote bad or violent themselves. A lot of the youth that we work with are victims or innocent bystanders to gun-related violence. And then when we do have youth that are kind of more directly involved in gun-related violence, a lot of the times it's a trauma response to things that are happening in their lives. So I think it's important for when working with youth and their families to kind of look in between the lines and to help us understand and help them with the things that they aren't saying.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've both worked closely, obviously, with survivors and also the families of those survivors. So what are some emotional and psychological impacts that you've seen that don't always get talked about, sort of that vicarious trauma sometimes?
Um, this kind of gets talked about, but I think when you work hands on, it's kind of you get to see it more on their personal level, but definitely the anxiety and the hypervigilance that these families and the youth experience when they go through a violent situation. It turns their whole world upside down and it makes them view the world differently at that point in time. So it affects their everyday life, family relationships, even schooling, truancy in school. It's a snowball effect that a lot of people don't realize that it could be a response to the trauma that they are experiencing.
Yeah, also that like goes back to even what you were just saying and what Siani and I were talking about of the fear that these kids feel after experiencing trauma or even just witnessing trauma, to where some of them actually feel like they would be safer if they carried guns. And then that, like you said, like snowballs, and it just actually becomes more gun violence and more problematic in the community.
Definitely.
Yeah, it's devastating.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that when the worldview changes for families who have experienced violent trauma, it also impacts the way that people can interact with otherwise positive supports, people, and things in their community and the way they engage in life. I think a big example that we see quite a bit for youth that are injured on SEPTA or on their way to school or in the community, they may not be accessing public transportation or attending school or going to the community events that they would otherwise be doing. So then they become more withdrawn from their social life and from their supports.
Wow, yeah. So you're even saying that, like, even after this like traumatic event happens to someone, let's say, like you said, like on their way to school, they, even if there are other opportunities and resources at the school that they could go and be part of, it's like this makes them even less likely to ever join those things, because it's like they've kind of developed this anxiety around even like getting there.
Yes, because what we know about trauma is it can really shape the way that people feel safe in situations. So even if that situation is now safe or safer, it's really difficult to feel that way and to feel at ease if that trauma hasn't been processed. And, a lot of the youth that we're working with are reliving the experience. They do look over their shoulder in a literal sense, and don't feel comfortable just being out in the world like they used to.
Yeah. And even I feel like people in the community and the educators too, like I have a feeling they don't always know exactly like how their own students are being impacted by this kind of violence that's in the city. We all know that it's happening, but it's like you just don't know when your students are actually facing those things like firsthand. So it can be hard to like reach youth in that regard.
Agreed. And trauma responses aren't always pretty or predictable. So a lot of times when a youth has experienced trauma in their life, that may come out as externalizing behaviors, acting out in the classroom, really experiencing different symptoms that can be challenging and sometimes leads to overdiagnoses and different types of pathologizing children that may have just experienced something that they haven't been supported through yet.
Yeah. Wow. That's like a really great way to put it, I guess, just in how much this actually does like emotionally impact kids, and they don't usually have the words to describe it, and especially without intervention like this, they would never know how to process it. So, yeah, again, the work that you guys do is just like incredible and so necessary for this city. Yeah, when you look across your own research, what systemic gaps in Philadelphia, kind of like what we were just talking about with school systems, healthcare, things like that, make people most vulnerable to violence? And what would it actually take to close those gaps?
I think collaboration. I know earlier you had talked about investment in communities and in schools. That's huge and that's critical to have access to resources, really quality programming, and people who care and are available.
Right.
But I do think that collaboration between the existing systems is something that we can really work on as a city, and it's something that our program does quite a bit. So we're coming from the healthcare space, but really trying to connect with the mental health providers that are in place, the juvenile justice system, the school systems. Sometimes it's the housing authority. It's trying to make sure that every system that's involved and has a touch point with the family is talking to one another, so that when we're supporting their child and the people in that family, we can do it holistically and it makes sense to them.
Right. And then also, like, you're actually able to give them all of the resources that they need and direct them to specific people and organizations that can help them with those things. It's not just kind of, you experience this traumatic event and we want to help you get through it and we'll figure it out along the way. It's like you actually have interconnectedness with other organizations in Philly that are trying to do better for the community.
Right.
So, based on your data, which prevention strategies have the strongest evidence behind them and why?
So I think it's important to share just our model because there are so many models out there for violence intervention work.
Yeah.
So at CHOP, our violence intervention program is a pediatric hospital-based violence intervention program. And so there is a lot of data to support having a really integrated program that can meet people right after their violent injury. We can meet people either when they're still in the hospital or soon after they're discharged from the emergency department, from the trauma unit, and be able to meet them in that moment to support them healing. I will shout out, there's also a lot of evidence to support community-based violence intervention models, violence interruption models, street outreach programs. And I think that we need all of those working in tandem to support people and be able to really meet them where they are. There's a lot of research to support the power of peer support and mentorship. And the way that we tap into that in our program, which is primarily a case management model, is we do offer a psychosocial group. It's called BRAVE, which is Building Resilience After a Violent Event.
Wow.
And so youth who go through our case management program can participate in this group, and they meet other peers who have experienced something similar. They can learn from one another. And then there's mentorship opportunities where they can come back and have leadership roles within that group.
Oh, wow. That's actually amazing. That's also giving purpose to these kids who like just experienced something so traumatic.
Yeah.
And knowing that they could actually potentially help other youth through the exact same situation, and like to see that there are opportunities after this, that it doesn't just have to end with that one moment, that one violence that they experienced. That's huge. So, how does your team engage with community leaders? Like you were saying, staying interconnected with other important like policymakers and decision makers in the community to bring these interventions to the ground and actually like do the change that we're talking about.
So we try to stay very integrated and involved in what's going on in this city because there are so many programs, organizations, and people who are aware of this systemic challenge and really trying to face it. Our program really partners with the city's Department of Public Health, and we're in a collaboration with other violence intervention providers to remain abreast of what's going on in the city, what are the best practices and ways that we can partner with one another. Our leadership in our program, both our medical directors and just some of our program leaders, have also provided written testimony at both the at both the city and the state level, just to provide their advocacy about the impact of trauma and really showing the support that is needed when it comes to trauma therapy and universal treatments.
Okay. Wow. So what does healing actually look like for these communities beyond just making these gun violence statistics like go down?
I would say healing looks like our youth and their families um, feeling supported and safe in their communities again. So whether that looks like them getting involved in an organization, different programming, school-related resources, and having them available and easily accessible to those families.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It also just goes back to what we were talking about of like giving them opportunities like the Brave program, and actually seeing them come out of their homes and participate again. I think that's huge. And so, yeah, I think that definitely speaks to the healing that we're talking about in communities like Philly. So thank you guys so much for walking us through that. Now we're going to discuss some things that maybe our listeners can actually take away with them as we work towards solutions for the city. So for young people listening today who might feel overwhelmed by the violence around them, what do you guys want them to know?
We want them to know that they are not alone, and there are resources out there that can help them and their family. People care about them, and to speak up about what they are seeing or how they are feeling so that help can be provided.
Right. The first step is just acknowledging that like you're not doing okay. And so many people, again, have been experiencing this same thing. So there's always going to be people who understand and can relate, unfortunately. What are some resources that you would recommend for those who may be struggling with trauma due to violence?
I think a lot about what we know about trauma involves the need to truly process and have a safe space to work
Right.
through what you've been through. So I would advocate for connecting with trauma therapy. Across the city, there's different providers. Also, there are grassroots nonprofit organizations in different neighborhoods that can really support youth who have experienced trauma. Just want to shout out one in West and Southwest.
Yeah.
There's Yeah Philly, which is an organization really designed to lift up youth who have experienced community violence, who are in need of a positive, meaningful, connective group,
Yeah.
and different community activities. So there are programs out there. Others include The Power of Paint, Beyond the Bars, which provide opportunities to engage creatively in
Yeah.
art, in music, and just creating accessible spaces for young people to be themselves and to have healthy, meaningful friendships.
Yeah, it matters to be able to go beyond all of this, like just this one experience. Or, I mean, in a city like Philadelphia, this kind of trauma is happening all the time. So often it's not just one experience, but yeah, creating those opportunities and resources is major, just based on the conversation that we've had here right now. So, lastly, what can communities do, entire communities do, starting right now to help prevent future harm?
Truly, I think it starts at the individual level and that each of us has an active role in violence prevention. Assuming the best of intentions when you're interacting with people, creating safe and understanding spaces for conflict resolution, providing opportunities for youth who may not know how to verbalize or articulate their feelings to get it out and process that, and just really approaching one another with compassion, with grace, and trying to understand where people are coming from because it may not match our assumption.
Right. Well, thank you guys so much for taking the time to speak with us. This has been extremely insightful. I feel like I've gotten to know a field of work that I otherwise wouldn't have known about. Your work shows us that we really do have the power, even in a city like Philly, where violence can feel like it's just never ending. We do have the power to change things and to actually impact the youth and make sure that this doesn't continue to be a problem here. And make sure youth can experience a city that they feel safe in.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Today's show was extremely eye opening.
Yes, it really was. Even in the midst of all of that, what we were facing today, what stands out to me is the resilience of Philly communities. We see people organizing, advocating, mentoring youth, and creating spaces for healing despite the pain they carry.
And that really speaks volumes to who the people of Philly really are. They're people who refuse to let violence be the only narrative. Instead, they're building hope, safety, and opportunity, even when the cards are often stacked against them.
For anyone listening who wants to make a difference, start where you are. Support local programs, show up for community events, advocate for safer policies, and check in on the people around you. We're stronger together when we lift each other up. Thanks for tuning in to the 17th Take. We hope today's conversation made you pause, reflect, or see Philly through a new lens. We'll be providing some resources too, including local mental health and crisis support services, community-based programs for youth and families, resources for survivors, youth, and loved ones, and also ways to get involved in the fight to make our city safer. If today's episode resonated with you, please consider sharing this episode and continuing this important conversation. Until next time, I'm Siani Strickland with the Community College of Philadelphia's Communication and Media Studies program and CCPTV studio. And this has been the 17th Take, where conversation meets perspective and awareness meets action.